Hey everybody, Professor Long here doing your A&P lectures. This is going to be my 2402 or A&P2 respiratory lecture number 3, which is going to cover, if you're following in my class in the note set, pages 71 through 73. Now, the first part of the lecture, I'm going to skip some stuff. I'm going to get the definitions along with the diagrams so you can wrap your brain around the terminology. And then I'm going to go back and cover the laws like Boyle's law and Dalton's law and some other things. I'm going to get into the details. Let's do the big picture first, okay? So follow along. This diagram is going to give you a basic understanding. It's a simplified way of doing things. As I always like to say in class, I'm not that smart, so I have to take the difficult concepts and simplify them so my feeble brain can understand them, and then I can extrapolate back to the difficult concepts. So imagine if we have a little person's head here with their mouth, their nasal, and their oral cavities, and then I have the respiratory tree come down with the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and I have the lungs here. Okay, the lungs are sitting like this. Okay, now I'm not going to draw all the other organs and everything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a capillary bed. A capillary bed is a whole bunch of little capillaries that are crisscrossing and networking together. And so I'm going to draw all these little red lines for a reason. The colors are specific, and then I'm going to carry that around to another capillary bed somewhere else in the body, and I'm going to make these vessels red for a specific reason I'll explain in a second, and then they're going to turn blue. The capillary bed will exchange colors or change colors, carry blood back this way, and then break up into another capillary bed. Now, without getting into the pulmonary ventilation or the pulmonary circuit, essentially what's happening is we're skipping the heart, so to speak, but as air comes in, it will enter the bloodstream and get delivered to our tissues and then make it back to our respiratory system. Of course, it would go through the heart and the right and left sides of the heart. We understand all that. So I'm skipping some information here. What I want you to get down here is that this is where I have a whole bunch of cells with their nuclei. These are my tissues deep down inside the body. And as you know, our cells have to take oxygen plus glucose. They run them through mitochondria, and coming out the other end as they make ATP, what we're going to get is a whole bunch of carbon dioxide plus some water plus some other stuff, okay? The ATPs remain inside the cell, but we're going to spit a lot of the carbon dioxide outside of the cell. Carbon dioxide, as I said before, if it builds up in high enough concentrations with water, that's a plus. Hold on, let me rewrite that a little bit neater. Carbon dioxide plus water. Carbon dioxide and water can enter into some dangerous chemical reactions and form an acid that dissociates and cause acidosis in our tissues. We can get respiratory or acidosis or alkalosis, a change in the pH, and that can drastically affect how the enzymes in the cells function and lead to death. So your blood pH is actually kind of one of the functions of your respiratory system, as it helps maintain our blood pH. We didn't list that on the functions, but that's one of the important things it does. So anyway, as our cells take in the oxygen has to come from somewhere. Now, one of the things I want to add to this picture here is that our atmosphere, and I'm just going to abbreviate it as ATM for the atmosphere. Our atmosphere is made up of certain types of gases. And surprising to a lot of people is it's somewhere around 79%, roughly speaking, nitrogen gas. Oops, not N2O, just N2. Nitrogen gas is one of the most abundant gases in the atmosphere. So now, the other two gases, or major gases that are in the atmosphere, is it's about 20 to 21% oxygen, O2, which we think is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, but it's not. And then it's about, or we should say, it is less than 1% carbon dioxide. As a matter of fact, there's many other gases that are, or several other gases that are in a higher abundance that are greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So it's less than 1% carbon dioxide. It's a small fraction of carbon dioxide. There's tetramethyl chloride and tetraethyl chloride and all these other gases that are also there that are considered greenhouse gases, but they're in low concentrations. Now, when we inhale and exhale, the movement of these gases from the atmosphere. And when we breathe them in, we don't get to pick which one we breathe in. We're going to breathe in all of the gases that are in the atmosphere, out in the air. But the reason we don't talk a lot about nitrogen is that nitrogen does not have a lot of solubility. Carbon dioxide and oxygen have a much higher solubility. When we talk about solubility, what we're talking about is the ability of a gas to dissolve into a solution. For example, if I had a big container here, okay, and I could put a cork in here with a little tube and hook it up to a hose and pump air in here, and this container has some water in it, which, as you know, your plasma is a large, 92% of your plasma is water. Now, it turns out that if I pumped a whole bunch of oxygen in here, oxygen has a solubility in water. Some of the oxygen can dissolve down into the water, which would actually make more room for more oxygen molecules to fit in here. So, for example, if I took a bucket of, a bottled water, and I took some Kool-Aid packet and dumped it in there, the Kool-Aid would start to dissolve and the water would become equally distributed with all the Kool-Aid molecules, and it wouldn't sit in a little pile in the bottom. That's because the Kool-Aid has a high solubility in water. Salt is soluble in water, sugar is soluble in water, oxygen has a solubility in water. Now, some things have a higher solubility than others. For example, if I took the same water and I dropped this marker in there and I could cap it off, if I came back in 1,000 years, it would look like some, say, pink water if I used a pink-looking Kool-Aid. But it would look like pink water with a marker sitting in it. The marker has almost zero solubility. Well, nitrogen's not very soluble in water. So the nitrogen, if I pumped it in here, would not dissolve in the water very well. So carbon dioxide actually has a higher solubility in water than oxygen. That's going to be important for our lectures in just a little bit. Okay. Now, one of the things that's important about this diagram is that this whole process of getting air to and from the external exchange surface is what we called in our definitions pulmonary ventilation. So, hold on a second. You can make some noise, son. Go ahead.
No, it's fine.
So, again, I'm doing this stuff from home and my kids are up, so they might make some noise in the background. But this is pulmonary ventilation, the movement of air to and from the exchange surface. Now, because oxygen and carbon dioxide are soluble in water, we do have the laws of diffusion. And in the law of diffusion, you know that any substance is going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. So it's a concentration gradient. Give you another concept that we've talked about before. If I have two areas separated by a semi-permeable membrane with holes in it, and I had a whole bunch of stuff on one side and a little bit of stuff on the other, I have set up a concentration gradient. So this substance will move from an area of higher to lower concentration. Well, pressure works that way too, and air will move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. And you can think of this as diffusion, or you can think of it as pressure gradients. But essentially, what we have is, as blood is returning back from my tissues, my blood has almost zero oxygen. The oxygen was given off and consumed by the tissues. So, because my blood has almost zero oxygen in it as it's returning, when a certain amount of blood, a certain volume, hits this capillary bed, there's almost no oxygen in it. The percentage of oxygen and the pressure of oxygen here is extremely low, almost zero oxygen. Not that there's none, but there's a very small amount. Now, when I have this membrane, which essentially is this membrane, I have a whole lot of oxygen in the lungs and almost no oxygen in the blood. This is why I use the red and the blue. As you know, hemoglobin is it's a pigment also that can glow bright red when an oxygen is bound, and it turns sort of a bluish green or a cyanin color, cyanosis, when carbon dioxide is bound. Since I have almost no oxygen here, the blood is going to be a different color. when it hits this capillary bed, all of the oxygen that's in the lung is going to want to cross this membrane and cross it very rapidly. So think of these molecules as oxygen. Oxygen is going to go from an area of high oxygen concentration from the atmosphere into my plasma, where I have a low oxygen concentration. So that's what's going to cause this exchange. Now, just like we have almost no oxygen, I have a pretty high concentration of carbon dioxide. As this blood was coming by here and hits this capillary bed, remember capillaries are the only vessels that allow the exchange of substances with the tissue, then all the carbon dioxide that's been building up in this tissue in a high concentration is going to go in the other direction. So let's say these little, let me use a different color here. Let's say these light blue dots are here. Let me use purple. You can probably see that better. If I got a whole bunch of purple molecules here and almost none over here, I've set up a concentration gradient for carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is going to want to go from the tissue into my plasma. I know the penmanship's terrible, but bear with me here. So carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to move in opposite directions. Oxygen is going to exit the blood into the tissue, and carbon dioxide is going to exit the tissue into the blood, which is why when this blood hits the capillary bed here, it's rich with carbon dioxide, has almost no oxygen. So across that same membrane, I can have two substances move in totally opposite directions. We're going to talk about that law of partial pressures in a little bit, but essentially what's happening is I'm getting an exchange of gases between the atmosphere and my blood at the alveoli. So this is what we called external respiration in our definitions. The exchange of gases between the atmosphere and the blood, and it's all based on concentration gradients or pressures, and both gases can move across the same membrane but in opposite directions. Now, when that happens, that little quantum of blood here that gave off carbon dioxide and picked up oxygen. So essentially what's going to happen is the CO2 is going to come out into the lungs, and the oxygen is going to come out of the lungs into the capillary bed. This blood is constantly moving, so the carbon dioxide comes rushing out, the oxygen comes rushing in at any opportunity that it gets, and now it's trapped in my vessels. And here I have a high concentration, or you can think of it as a high pressure of oxygen. I have almost zero carbon dioxide. I gave most of it off. Is there a little carbon dioxide trapped in your plasma? Sure, but it's minuscule. So now this drop of blood is going to come around here, and it's going to hit this capillary bed, and again, I'm going to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. The oxygen is going to exit my plasma and go into the interstitial fluid. The carbon dioxide is going to come out of the interstitial fluid and enter my capillary. So I have capillary exchange again. And again, we did the dynamic center tissue perfusion recall of fluids happening in our blood lectures. But this process of exchanging gases between the plasma and the interstitial fluid is internal respiration. I'm going to abbreviate these terms because we've already written them down and covered them. But now you can get a visual of what's going on. And one of the important things to know is that oxygen and carbon dioxide are soluble in water or soluble in our plasma, which is mostly water. The nitrogen is not, unless we increase the pressure. You can talk about divers and breathing atmospheric oxygen in the oxygen tanks when they go deep under the ocean, and the pressure forces some of the nitrogen in, and that's what wants to come bubbling out when they rise too rapidly. It's almost like shaking a soda, and all the nitrogen would be, all the carbon dioxide and carbonated water would be shaking around, bumping each other, trying to bubble out, knock each other out. But they have nowhere to go. As soon as you take the lid off, it comes rushing out, and that's kind of like what's happening here. Boom, all this carbon dioxide pops out, all the oxygen falls in. And every little drop of blood is doing this, doing the gas exchange, delivering the oxygen to our tissues, removing carbon dioxide to the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation, moving air to and from. We're going to see how that works in a minute. We have external respiration, the exchange of gases between the atmosphere and the blood across the capillary wall. We're going to have internal respiration, the exchange of gases between the plasma and the tissue across the same capillary wall. And again, the gases move based on their own individual concentration gradients or pressures. So one of the laws that's in the note set on page 71 is Boyle's law. And basically Boyle's law says that gases the pressure of a gas in a closed system is inversely proportional to the volume. We didn't talk about that in this video. We're going to talk about it in the next video. But nonetheless, we'll get into that. That's how pulmonary ventilation works, all right? So I'm going to start the next video with this drawing still up here, but I'm going to erase a lot of this, and I'm going to eventually erase that. If you go on to page 72 of the note set, it's going to talk about Dalton's law of partial pressure. And that's what's happening here. Essentially, a scientist named Dalton figured out that gases in a closed system each will apply their own pressure. So let me draw this in a picture so that I can help you make sense of it. But let's say I take a jug or even a balloon and I tie it off and I pumped a whole bunch of gas in here. Let's say it's this atmospheric gas. The nitrogen molecules that are in here are going to be bouncing around off the walls, and as they bounce around, they're putting pressure on the wall. So I can calculate the pressure that all the nitrogen atoms and nitrogen molecules are applying. If I put oxygen in here, the oxygen is also going to be bouncing around, putting pressure on the walls. So I can measure the partial pressure of oxygen. I know how much pressure nitrogen is applying and how much oxygen. I could also measure the carbon dioxide, and I would have three partial pressures. I have the pressure of each gas doing its own part. If I add them all up, then I get the total gas pressure of the system. So Dalton's law basically says that each gas applies its own pressure. Also, a part of it is each gas will move based upon its pressures. So because my capillary membrane is permeable to both oxygen and carbon dioxide, remember they're lipid soluble, if I'm at the atmosphere, all the oxygen will move one way, the carbon dioxide will move the other based on their own partial pressures in this system. When I get to the tissues, the carbon dioxide is going to move from the tissue to the plasma, and the oxygen is going to move from the plasma into the tissue across the same membrane. We just reverse it based on their partial pressures. That's what Dalton's law of partial pressure is all about. Each gas in a closed system will exert its own pressure, and they will basically behave based on their own pressure. They don't care about the pressures or concentrations of other gases. And then finally, there's Henry's law of the diffusion of gases between the atmosphere and liquid, or between air and liquid, which is the law of solubility. I'm not going to make you memorize whose law is which. Some instructors may. But basically, it's saying that some gases are soluble in liquids. Oxygen and carbon dioxide have a higher solubility in a liquid than does nitrogen. So that's Henry's law, is the law of solubility. Anyway, I'm going to go into some more details about pulmonary ventilation and how we accomplish it by expanding and contracting the volume of the thoracic cavity and the volume of the lungs. That's going to focus on Boyle's law, the laws of pressure and volume being inversely proportional. Remember, in an inverse relationship, if pressure goes up, volume goes down, and vice versa. We're going to do that in the next video. So I hope you understood pulmonary ventilation. I hope you understand the concentrations of the gases, the major gases in our atmosphere, and then what causes external respiration and internal respiration, which is the gases moving moving down their concentration gradients or their pressure gradients. So I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope that made sense. I hope you can follow my messy little drawings. Anyway, hope you learned something, and I hope you have a good day. Thanks for watching.